The rain fell in heavy sheets that night, but it wasn't the storm that unsettled Richard. It was the knock at his door, a hesitant, desperate knock that seemed to carry the weight of a secret. When he opened it, he found a woman, drenched and trembling, asking for shelter. "Welcome to our channel, where we bring you heartwarming tales of hope, kindness, and unexpected twists. Here, we believe in the power of stories to inspire and connect us all. If you're a fan of touching narratives that move the soul, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe, as your support fuels our passion to craft even more beautiful and uplifting stories for you." It was a cold, rainy evening, and Richard sat quietly in his small apartment, sipping tea and listening to the soft pitter-patter of raindrops on the windowsill. Life had become lonely for Richard after his wife passed away years ago, and his days were filled with routines that offered little excitement. He was a landlord, owning a few small apartments in the building where he lived, but all of them were empty now except for his own. His life was quiet and still. Until that night, a sudden knock on the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not in this weather. Richard stood up slowly, his knees creaking a little as he walked toward the door. When he opened it, he was met by a sight that tugged at his heartstrings. A young woman, drenched from head to toe, shivering in the cold night air. Her clothes were soaked, her hair clung to her face, and she looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept or eaten in days. "Please," she said softly, her voice shaking. "I don't know where else to go." Richard looked at her, feeling a surge of sympathy. She looked so desperate, so lost. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let her enter the warmth of his home. The woman hesitated for a moment, as if she wasn't sure she could trust him, but then her legs gave in, and she stumbled inside. After offering her a towel and a cup of hot tea, Richard sat down across from her. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "I'm Ruthie," she said, her eyes downcast as she wrapped the towel tightly around herself. "I had lost my job a few months ago. I don't have any money left, and I've been trying to find a place to stay, but no one will help me. I've been sleeping in shelters, but tonight there was no space, and I had nowhere else to go." Richard could see the exhaustion in her face, and the sadness in her eyes reminded him of his own loneliness. He knew what it felt like to have nowhere to turn. "I'm sorry you've been through so much," he said, his voice filled with kindness. "I don't have much to offer, but I do have an empty apartment upstairs. It's small and not very fancy, but it's warm and dry." Ruthie's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? You would let me stay there?" Richard nodded. "Of course. You can stay for a few days until you figure things out." Tears filled Ruthie's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't think anyone would be this kind." Richard smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He showed Ruthie to the small apartment on the top floor of the building. The apartment was simple, just a bed, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. It wasn't much, but it was a safe place, and that was what Ruthie needed most. For the next few days, Richard didn't see much of Ruthie. She kept to herself, and he respected her privacy. But late at night, he sometimes heard strange sounds coming from the apartment, whispers, soft footsteps, and the quiet creak of the floorboards. It made him curious, but he didn't want to intrude. Still, something about the way Ruthie was so secretive made him wonder if she was hiding something. His friends, when they heard about the situation, were quick to warn him. "Richard, you shouldn't let strangers into your home," one of them said. "You don't know anything about her. What if she's dangerous?" But Richard refused to listen. There was something in Ruthie's eyes that told him she wasn't dangerous, just scared. He couldn't turn his back on her, especially knowing how much she had already suffered. He chose to trust his instincts, believing that his act of kindness would make a difference in her life. A few days later, Richard had to leave town for some personal business. Before he left, he checked on Ruthie one last time. She seemed grateful but still distant, As he drove away, a strange feeling lingered in his chest. Something about Ruthie was a mystery, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she had told him. Richard promised himself he would find out the truth when he returned. Little did he know, what awaited him when he got back would be far more shocking than anything he could have imagined. When Richard returned to his apartment building after several days away, he expected everything to be as he had left it, quiet, peaceful, and unchanged. But as he walked toward the door of the building, a strange feeling crept into his chest. Something was different. The usual silence of the place felt heavier, almost like the building itself was holding a secret. He quickened his pace, eager to check on Ruthie, the young woman he had let stay in his spare apartment. He climbed the stairs to the top floor where Ruthie was staying. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. There was no response at first, so he gently turned the doorknob, finding it unlocked. The door creaked open, and as he stepped inside, Richard was completely unprepared for what he saw. The apartment was utterly transformed. Where there had once been only bare walls and a single bed, the space was now warm and inviting. Soft rugs covered the floors, and flowers sat in small vases on the windowsills, their bright colors lighting up the room. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air, and curtains fluttered gently in the breeze. The once empty apartment now felt like a home. But it wasn't just the changes to the apartment that shocked him. Sitting on the bed was a small child, a little girl who looked no older than 4 or 5. Her face was pale, and her body looked fragile, wrapped in a blanket as she lay resting quietly. Richard's heart skipped a beat. Ruthie had never mentioned having a child. The girl must have been hidden away this whole time. At that moment, Ruthie emerged from the kitchen, her eyes widening when she saw Richard standing in the doorway. She froze, clearly not expecting him to return so soon. Her face flushed with fear, but before Richard could say anything, she rushed to explain. "I'm sorry, Richard. I didn't mean to deceive you," Ruthie said, her voice trembling as she approached him. She glanced at the little girl on the bed, her eyes filling with tears. "This is Anne. She's my daughter." Richard was speechless, his mind racing with questions. How long had the child been there? Why had Ruthie kept her hidden? He struggled to find his voice as Ruthie continued, her words coming in a desperate rush. "I didn't tell you about her because I was scared," Ruthie said, her hands shaking. "No one will help a single mother. People turn away the moment they see a child, and I didn't want you to refuse us shelter. We've been through so much, and Anne, she's been so sick." Richard's heart softened as he looked at the frail little girl on the bed. Anne's eyes were closed, her breathing soft and weak. He could see now that Ruthie hadn't been keeping secrets out of dishonesty, but out of fear. The weight of her struggle pressed down on him. She had been protecting her daughter the only way she knew how. "Why didn't you tell me from the start?" Richard asked quietly, trying to mask the hurt in his voice. "I didn't know if I could trust you," Ruthie whispered, her tears spilling over. "Everyone has turned us away, Richard. We've been living in shelters, sleeping on the streets. Anne got sick, and I couldn't afford to take her to a doctor. I thought if you knew about her, you'd throw us out too. I didn't know what else to do." Richard felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had opened his home to Ruthie out of kindness, but now he realized how desperate her situation truly was. She had been carrying the weight of her daughter's illness all alone, hiding Anne to protect her from a world that had offered them nothing but rejection. For a long moment, Richard said nothing, his eyes moving from Ruthie to Anne. He could see the deep love Ruthie had for her daughter, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes. It was the look of a mother who would do anything for her child, even if it meant lying to a kind stranger. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I wish you had told me the truth, Ruthie. I would have helped you. I still want to help." Ruthie looked at him in surprise, her tears flowing more freely now. She had expected him to be angry, to throw them both out. Instead, here he was, offering them more kindness than she could have ever hoped for. "You mean, you'll let us stay?" Ruthie asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Richard nodded. Yes, Ruthie. But first, we need to get Anne to a doctor. She looks very sick, and I won't let you face this alone anymore. Ruthie broke down in tears, overwhelmed by Richard's generosity. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope. As Richard helped Ruthie gather Anne's things, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed in a way he never expected. Little did he know, the journey ahead would bring even more surprises and challenges, but also something far greater, an unexpected family. After Richard helped Ruthie gather her daughter Anne's belongings, they rushed to the local clinic. The drive there was quiet, filled with a sense of urgency and hope. Richard could see the fear in Ruthie's eyes as she held Anne close, whispering gentle words of comfort to her frail daughter. Anne's face was pale, and she was too weak to speak, but the soft rise and fall of her chest reassured them both that time wasn't entirely against them. When they arrived at the clinic, the doctors quickly took Anne in for an examination. Richard stayed beside Ruthie, offering her quiet support as she anxiously waited. The minutes felt like hours, but finally, the doctor emerged with a solemn expression on his face. Your daughter is severely malnourished and dehydrated, the doctor said, looking at Ruthie. But the good news is we can treat her. She'll need proper care, rest, and good nutrition. But with the right attention, she'll recover. Ruthie broke down in tears of relief. For so long, she had been terrified that something terrible would happen to Anne, and now, hearing that her daughter could be saved, it felt like a weight had been lifted off her chest. Richard, standing beside her, gently placed his hand on her shoulder. He hadn't known Ruthie or Anne for long, but in that moment, he realized just how deeply he had come to care for them. Over the next few weeks, Richard helped Ruthie care for Anne as she slowly regained her strength. He paid for her medical bills without hesitation, seeing it as the least he could do. Ruthie, overwhelmed with gratitude, could hardly express how thankful she was. You didn't have to do any of this, she told him one evening after Anne had fallen asleep in her new comfortable bed. We were strangers to you, but you've given us so much. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Richard smiled warmly. You don't need to repay me, Ruthie. Sometimes, helping someone in need is repayment enough. Besides, I haven't had much purpose in my life since my wife passed. You and Anne, you've brought some light back into my world. Ruthie's eyes filled with tears once again, but this time, they were tears of gratitude and happiness. She had never expected anyone to care for her and her daughter the way Richard had. After all the struggles she had faced, losing her job, being turned away from shelters, and watching her daughter grow sicker and weaker, this act of kindness felt like a miracle. As the days turned into weeks, Anne grew stronger, her cheeks filling out and her smile returning. Richard spent more and more time with both Ruthie and Anne, sharing meals together and helping Anne with small projects around the apartment. The quiet, empty building that had once been his home now felt lively and full of warmth. It was as though life had returned to a place that had been empty for so long. One evening, as they sat around the table for dinner, Anne looked up at Richard with a shy smile. Thank you, Mr. Richard, she said softly, her voice still a little weak but full of sincerity, for helping me and my mommy. Richard's heart melted at the sound of her voice. He smiled and reached out to gently ruffle her hair. You're very welcome, Anne, he said. I'm glad you're feeling better. You've been very brave. Ruthie watched the interaction, her heart swelling with emotion. In Richard, she had found not just a kind landlord, but someone who had become like family. And Richard, too, felt the same. His once lonely life had been filled with purpose and connection again, thanks to Ruthie and her daughter. One day, while sitting with Richard after dinner, Ruthie looked at him with a thoughtful expression. I've been thinking, she began softly. I found a new job in town, and once I'm back on my feet, Anne and I can move out. I don't want to be a burden to you. Richard shook his head gently. You're not a burden, Ruthie. You and Anne are welcome here as long as you need. This place feels like a home again, thanks to the both of you." Tears filled Ruthie's eyes once more, but this time they were tears of joy. She hadn't known what to expect when she knocked on Richard's door that rainy night, but she never could have imagined the kindness and generosity she would receive. As the months passed, Richard, Ruthie, and Anne grew closer, forming an unexpected family of sorts. While life wasn't perfect, there was a sense of peace, warmth, and love that filled their days. Richard, once lonely and without purpose, had found meaning in helping Ruthie and Anne, and they had found a safe, loving place to rebuild their lives. The story of their time together was one of kindness, second chances, and the healing power of connection. In the end, the bonds they had formed were stronger than any hardship, and the apartment building that had once been empty now echoed with laughter and love. Thank you so much for watching. We truly appreciate your time and support. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Your engagement means the world to us, and it helps us continue to create meaningful content.